My name is Aaron Whitfield. I am employed by the State Forestry Service as a seasonal fire lookout, assigned to Tower 17 in a remote stretch of managed wilderness, several hours from the nearest paved road. I have been trained to document conditions accurately and without embellishment, and what I am about to recount is written in that same spirit. I am not prone to superstition. I do not consume alcohol while on duty, and I have no prior history of sleep disorders or hallucinations. What follows occurred over the course of a single operational day and night, beginning at 05:40 in the morning and ending shortly after dawn the next day. Tower 17 is a steel-framed structure, bolted into exposed granite at the top of a ridgeline. The cab sits roughly 60 feet above the ground, accessible by a single vertical ladder enclosed in a safety cage. From the cab, I have an unobstructed view of approximately 40 miles of forest in every direction. The nearest trailhead is over 12 miles away. There are no public access routes anywhere near the tower, and casual foot traffic is not possible without deliberate planning and navigation. My assignment began uneventfully. Weather conditions were stable, humidity low, visibility excellent. I performed the standard morning equipment, checks radio functionality, anemometer rotation, Osborne firefinder calibration, and logbook review. At 07:10, I recorded a routine smoke to the south that resolved into a dust plume from a service vehicle on a distant access road. Nothing out of the ordinary. At approximately 09:30, I noticed movement in the tree line directly below the western face of the ridge. At first I assumed it was wildlife. Elk and black bear are both common in the area, and from above, movement between trees can be misleading. I lifted my binoculars and adjusted focus. The movement stopped immediately. That alone was not concerning. Animals freeze when observed. I lowered the binoculars and resumed my scan. Roughly 2 minutes later, movement resumed, this time farther downslope and slightly north. I checked again. The shape was upright. It was human. There are procedures for this. Lost hikers do occasionally wander into restricted areas, though rarely this far from any established trail. I logged the sighting and attempted to raise dispatch on the radio. There was a brief delay before response, attributed later to atmospheric interference. Dispatch had no active missing person reports in the vicinity and no authorized personnel scheduled to be in my sector. By 10:15, I could confirm at least 3 individuals moving independently through the forest below. They did not appear to be together, yet their spacing was consistent, roughly equidistant, forming a loose arc that followed the contour of the ridge. None wore high visibility clothing. I could not see packs or gear. What stood out most was their pace. They moved slowly, stopping frequently, not as if resting, but as if waiting. I used the binoculars again. Their heads were tilted upward. I did not wave. Fire lookout protocol discourages unnecessary interaction unless contact is clearly required. I instead broadcast a general advisory over the radio, identifying myself and the tower location, stating that the area was restricted, and asking any hikers to identify themselves. There was no reply. The individuals continued to stand motionless for several minutes, then resumed movement. At 11:40, they disappeared into heavier canopy cover, directly below the ladder side of the tower. From that angle, visibility was poor. I felt an unexpected sense of unease, not panic, but a persistent awareness that my position, normally an advantage, had become a limitation. I could see far, but not directly down. Around noon, I heard the first sound from below. It was not a voice, It was the metallic clink of something striking rock, irregular but deliberate. I leaned over the cab railing and looked down the ladder cage. There was no one visible. The sound stopped. I radioed dispatch again. This time the connection was clear. I reported the presence of multiple, unidentified individuals below the tower, and the lack of response to hailing. Dispatch acknowledged and advised me to maintain wide observation, avoid engagement, and report any escalation. A ranger unit was unavailable until the following morning. By early afternoon, the forest had gone quiet in a way that did not match normal patterns. Wind remained steady, but birds were absent. Insects were minimal. I ate a late lunch standing by the windows, scanning continuously. At 14:20, one of the individuals emerged into a small clearing about 200 yards from the base of the tower. He stood fully exposed, facing directly toward me. He raised his arm. This time, I did wave back, briefly, more out of reflex than intention. The man lowered his arm and stepped back into the trees. Within minutes, 2 more figures appeared in separate clearings, each one facing the tower, each one standing still. None waved. None attempted to approach openly. They remained visible just long enough for me to register their presence, then retreated. I recorded everything in the logbook. Timestamps, directions, estimated distances. The act of writing grounded me. The situation was unusual but not yet dangerous. That is what I told myself. At 1600, I heard footsteps on the ladder cage. The sound was unmistakable. A slow, deliberate climb. Metal rung pause. Metal rung pause. I moved to the center of the cab and looked down through the floor hatch. The ladder below was empty. The climbing sound continued for several seconds, then stopped abruptly. No vibration. No visual confirmation. I waited, holding my breath, counting silently. After nearly a minute, the sound resumed, this time descending. I contacted dispatch immediately. I described the auditory disturbance and confirmed there was no visual contact. Dispatch suggested thermal expansion of the structure due to temperature shifts, a known phenomenon in towers of this age. The explanation was plausible. I wanted it to be correct. As the sun began to lower, I noticed something else. New shapes at the edge of visibility. Farther out now, just beyond the range where detail is clear. More figures. At least 5, maybe more. They were no longer moving in arcs. They were positioned evenly around the ridge, forming a rough circle. None of them looked away. By 1830, light conditions were changing. Shadows lengthened, and the forest floor became a mosaic of dark patches. I turned on the cab lights and checked all access points. The trapdoor was secured. The radio was functional. My emergency beacon was within reach. I told myself that I was safe, elevated, isolated by design. At 1910, as the last direct sunlight faded, every figure below stepped backward into the trees at the same time. The forest went completely still. I remained in the cab, lights on, binoculars unused, listening to the sounds of my own breathing and the wind against the glass. Night operations are part of the job, but that evening, the darkness felt closer than usual, as if it were pressing upward instead of settling down. That was when I realized something I had not considered before. Throughout the day, none of the individuals had ever looked away from the tower. I remained awake long after full darkness settled, not because protocol required it, but because sleep no longer felt possible. The tower creaked softly as temperatures dropped, a familiar sound I had learned to tune out over previous seasons. Yet that night every shift of metal registered as intent rather than physics. I kept the cab lights on despite the glare against the windows, aware that it made me visible from below, but equally aware that turning them off would leave me staring into my own reflection and whatever might be behind it. At 20:05, I logged a final daylight entry, noting visible human activity. Writing that felt dishonest but technically accurate. Nothing was visible. Visibility and presence, I was learning, were not the same thing. The radio crackled intermittently with routine traffic from other sectors. Distant voices reporting humidity readings and wind shifts. Hearing them should have been reassuring. Instead, it emphasized how alone my position was. When I keyed the mic to report that conditions remained stable, my own voice sounded thinner than usual, stretched by the open air. At approximately 20:40, I noticed movement again, this time not in the forest, but in the glass. A shadow passed across the eastern window, tall and narrow, too defined to be cloud cover. I turned slowly, scanning each pane in sequence. The shadow did not repeat. I checked the anemometer reading. Wind direction had not changed. I reminded myself that the cab sits above the tree line. Nothing should be able to cast a shadow at that height, unless it was close to the tower itself. I pushed that thought aside and focused on procedure. I performed a second perimeter check, walking the interior slowly, counting steps, touching each window frame, grounding myself in the physical space. At 21:15, I heard the ladder again. This time, the sound was louder. There was no mistaking the rhythm of weight transferring from rung to rung. It was ascending, steadily, without hesitation. I went directly to the hatch and looked down. The beam of my flashlight cut through the cage, illuminating empty metal all the way to the ground. No hands. No boots. The sound continued regardless, reaching the platform level beneath the cab. Then it stopped. I waited for the vibration of someone stepping onto the landing. It never came. Instead, there was a pause long enough that my arms began to ache from holding the light steady. Then the sound resumed, moving laterally, as if something were circling the base of the cab, just out of sight. I backed away from the hatch and locked it, even though it was already secured. The click of the latch felt insignificant. I radioed dispatch again, my report more urgent now. My words carefully chosen to avoid sounding panicked. I described repeated ladder sounds with no visual confirmation. There was a delay before response. When dispatch came back, the voice was unfamiliar, clipped, focused. I was told to remain inside the cab, log all activity, and activate the emergency beacon only if direct contact occurred. I asked if anyone else had reported unusual activity. The answer was no. By 2200, the forest below the tower was no longer uniformly dark. Patches of deeper blackness moved slowly between the trees, subtle but distinct, like holes in the night shifting position. I watched them for a long time, binoculars useless in the low light. They never approached the tower directly. They simply repositioned, maintaining distance, maintaining that circular spacing I had observed earlier. I realized then that the spacing matched the limits of my visibility. Wherever my line of sight ended, that was where they stood. The thought unsettled me more than the sounds. At 20:47, something touched the tower. Not the ladder. The tower itself. A dull impact reverberated through the steel, followed by a faint scraping noise along one of the support beams. I froze, listening. Another impact followed, higher this time, closer to the cab. The sound was not forceful. It was exploratory, like knuckles testing a surface. I switched off the cab lights. The darkness inside was immediate and total. I stood motionless, counting my breaths, listening. Outside, the impact stopped. For a moment, there was nothing at all. Then, from directly beneath the cab, a voice spoke. It said my name. The voice was calm, evenly paced, and carried upward clearly, as if spoken through a megaphone rather than open air. It was not distorted. It did not echo. It was simply there, addressing me with the familiarity of someone who expected a response. I did not answer. The voice continued, speaking in complete sentences, informing me that they had been trying to get my attention all day, that they were concerned about the height, about my isolation, about how easily accidents happen in places like this. The tone was reasonable, almost rehearsed. It sounded like someone reciting a safety briefing. I edged back toward the radio, careful not to make noise. I keyed the mic without speaking, hoping dispatch might hear the open channel. The voice below paused. "I know you're there," it said. "You don't need the light." The radio emitted a burst of static so loud it made me flinch. When it cleared, the channel was dead. No background chatter, no carrier signal, just silence. Outside, the shapes in the forest began to move again, slowly converging, tightening the circle. I could sense them without seeing them, a pressure in the air, a shift in the way sound traveled. The voice below resumed, now closer, though I had not heard any climbing. It told me they would wait. That was when I understood the purpose of their stillness, their patience. They were not lost. They were not confused. They were conducting an assessment, measuring my responses, my habits, my thresholds. The tower was not a barrier to them. It was a variable. I logged everything with shaking hands, writing in the dark by headlamp. My words cramped and uneven. Midnight passed unnoticed. Time had become abstract, marked only by sounds and the tightening awareness of being observed from every direction. At some point, footsteps returned to the ladder. Not climbing, not descending, just shifting weight in place, as if someone were standing on a rung, waiting. I did not sleep. I marked 0100 in the log, without remembering when the hour began. The headlamp beam trembled as I wrote, not from fatigue alone, but from the effort of keeping my breathing controlled. Outside the cab, the forest had settled into a soundless state that felt engineered rather than natural. Even the wind had dropped. The tower stood in a pocket of still air, isolated not just by height, but by absence. The footsteps on the ladder did not resume in any predictable way. Instead, there were subtle cues that something remained there. A faint metallic tick as weight shifted. A low vibration through the frame that stopped when I focused on it and resumed when I turned away. I forced myself to remain seated, back against the desk, eyes scanning the windows in a slow, deliberate pattern. At 0127, a shape appeared at the edge of the northern window. Not a silhouette in the forest this time, but something closer, darker than the night behind it. I leaned forward, careful, and adjusted the angle of the headlamp, just enough to catch the outline. It was a hand, not gripping the frame, not pressing against the glass. Just resting there, fingers splayed, palm flat, as if testing the surface. The skin looked pale in the narrow beam, almost reflective. The fingers were long, joints pronounced. There was no visible dirt, no sign of injury or exposure that would be consistent with someone spending hours moving through rough terrain. I did not move. I did not breathe. After several seconds, the hand slid downward, slowly, leaving no mark, no condensation, no sound. It vanished below the window line. I waited for the thud of someone dropping back to the platform. There was nothing. I activated the emergency beacon at 01:40. The device emitted a steady pulse, barely audible over the silence, but reassuring in its regularity. I reported the activation over the radio, though the channel remained dead. The act of speaking felt important, even if no one heard it. It anchored me to procedure, to the expectation that this situation had an endpoint beyond endurance. Shortly after the beacon began transmitting, the voice returned. This time, it did not come from below. It came from all sides at once, carried on the metal of the tower itself, resonating through beams and bolts until it was impossible to determine direction. The voice was unchanged in tone, still calm, still measured. It acknowledged the beacon, noted that help would take time, and suggested that waiting inside a confined space under stress was not ideal for decision-making. I told it to identify itself. There was a pause, long enough that I wondered if I had imagined the previous sounds entirely. Then it answered, not with a name, but with a description of my routine. It spoke about the way I favored the eastern window during morning scans, the habit I had of tapping the desk when thinking, the exact number of steps I took during my perimeter checks. Details that were accurate, specific, and recent. I felt something cold settle in my chest. At 02:30, the shapes in the forest shifted again. I could see them now, not clearly, but enough to confirm their number had increased. They stood at varying distances, some close enough that I should have been able to hear movement, others at the limit of sight. None approached directly. Instead, they adjusted their positions incrementally, maintaining a geometry that felt intentional. The voice suggested that I turn off the beacon to conserve power. I refused. There was no immediate response to that. Instead, the tower shuddered, a brief, sharp vibration that rattled the glass and sent my headlamp skittering across the desk. Something struck one of the support beams hard enough to be felt, not heard. I braced myself, expecting escalation, but it did not come. The forest returned to stillness. I checked the time again at 03:07. Dawn was still hours away. Fatigue began to play tricks on my perception. Shadows deepened, edges blurred. I fought the urge to sit down, to close my eyes even for a moment. Training warns against this. In high-stress isolation, micro-sleeps can blur the line between waking and dreaming. I paced instead, slow circuits of the cab, reciting equipment checklists under my breath. At 03:45, I noticed a change in the smell of the air. It was faint, but distinct, metallic and damp, like wet stone after a storm. It did not belong at that height, with that wind pattern. The smell intensified near the hatch. I backed away, heart pounding, listening for movement below. There was none. The voice spoke again, closer now, as if standing directly against the metal beneath my feet. It told me that the tower was an inefficient shelter, that its height created vulnerabilities, that staying inside limited my options. It suggested that coming down voluntarily would reduce the risk of injury. I asked how many of them there were. The voice did not answer directly. Instead, it described the radius of the ridge, the blind spots in my visibility, the places where the terrain folded inward. It told me that I had already seen most of them, that the rest were positioned where seeing them would not be useful to me. At 04:20, I heard something new. Footsteps on the stairs inside the tower. Not the ladder, not the platform. Inside. Slow. Measured steps ascending from below the cab. I stared at the hatch, every muscle locked, mind racing through impossible explanations. The hatch did not move. The steps continued, reaching the level just beneath the floor. Then they stopped. The smell intensified. I realized then that the voice had never asked me to open the hatch. It had never demanded entry. It had only waited, observed, adjusted. Whatever was happening did not require permission in the way I understood it. The first hint of dawn came at 05:05, a thin gray line at the horizon. The forest began to regain depth, shadows separating into recognizable shapes. As light returned, the figures below did not retreat. They remained in place, more visible now, their forms resolving into outlines that still lacked detail. The voice fell silent. When full daylight finally broke, the forest was empty. No figures, no movement, no sound beyond the returning birds. The ladder was clear. The ground below showed no tracks, no disturbed vegetation, nothing to suggest hours of presence. The emergency beacon continued to pulse, steady and indifferent. At 6:30, dispatch came through on the radio, clear and strong, asking me to confirm status. I responded immediately. They told me a ranger unit was en route and advised me to remain in place. I agreed. I am writing this now with the sun fully up, the world looking exactly as it should. The logbook entries are intact. The equipment is functional. There is no physical evidence of what occurred overnight. But I have not stopped noticing one thing. From the tower, I can still see the limits of my visibility. And wherever that line falls, I feel certain that something is standing just beyond it, waiting for night to return. The ranger unit arrived at 7:45, later than estimated due to a washout on the access road. I heard the engine long. Before I saw the vehicle, a low mechanical sound cutting cleanly through the morning air. Relief should have followed. Instead, I felt a tightening in my chest, a sudden awareness that the presence of other people changed the situation in ways I could not yet predict. I did not go down to meet them. Procedure dictates that I remain in the cab until instructed otherwise, but that was not the real reason. From the moment the engine noise reached the ridge, I became aware of a subtle shift in the forest. Not movement, not sound. Something closer to attention being redirected. The sense of pressure that had surrounded the tower overnight did not vanish with daylight. It adjusted. The radio crackled with the ranger's call sign. I answered, confirmed my condition, and was told they would conduct a sweep of the area before approaching the tower. I watched them from above as they moved through the trees. Methodical, alert, clearly not expecting to find anything. Their body language was relaxed in a way that felt dangerous. I wanted to warn them. I opened my mouth to speak, then hesitated. I did not know what to say that would not sound irrational. There were no tracks, no evidence. Only my account, recorded faithfully but unsupported by anything they could see. As the rangers circled the base of the tower, I noticed something else. Wherever they walked, the forest behind them seemed unchanged, but ahead of them, shadows deepened slightly, edges blurring just enough to make depth perception unreliable. I watched one ranger pause, shake his head, adjust his stance as if the ground had shifted unexpectedly beneath his boot. He laughed it off. I heard it faintly through the open window. At 08:20, they reached the ladder and began their ascent. I forced myself to watch the entire climb, every rung, every movement, confirming visually that nothing accompanied them. The ladder remained empty, except for the two men climbing in sequence. When they reached the cab, I unlocked the hatch and stepped back, hands visible, movements deliberate. Their reactions were exactly what I expected. Professional concern, careful neutrality. They asked about sleep, hydration, stress. They reviewed my logbook, noting the detailed entries, the consistent timestamps. One of them commented that my handwriting deteriorated sharply after midnight, then returned to normal at dawn. I did not argue. They conducted a full inspection of the cab and tower structure. No damage. No signs of tampering. The emergency beacon was functioning correctly. Radio diagnostics showed no faults. When they checked the ladder cage, one ranger frowned briefly, pointing out a faint scuff mark on a rung near the top. It could have been old. It could have been mine. They decided to escort me down for a break, while they took over observation temporarily. I agreed, though the thought of descending filled me with a quiet dread I could not explain. As I climbed down, rung by rung, I kept my eyes fixed on the metal in front of me, resisting the urge to look out into the trees. I was acutely aware of how exposed the ladder was, how narrow my focus had to be to maintain balance. When my boots touched the ground, the forest felt wrong. Not hostile, not threatening, simply arranged incorrectly, like a familiar room with furniture shifted just enough to trip you in the dark. Sounds were present, birds calling, wind in the canopy, but their spacing felt uneven. Too close in some directions, too distant in others. The rangers led me to their vehicle, speaking casually, asking questions that skirted the edges of the night's events without addressing them directly. I answered honestly, sticking to observable facts. One of them asked if I had seen anyone leave the area after dawn. I said no. While they checked in with dispatch, I stood beside the vehicle and looked back toward the tower. From ground level, it appeared ordinary, a thin silhouette against the sky. I tried to reconcile that image with the memory of hands on glass, footsteps inside sealed spaces, voices that knew me too well. That was when I noticed the spacing again. From the ground, the trees formed a rough ring around the tower at a consistent distance, thicker there than elsewhere, as if growth patterns had been subtly guided over time. It was not something you would notice without a reason to look for it. I had that reason now. At Zoar 9 and 10, dispatch instructed the rangers to escort me out for mandatory rest. Another lookout would cover the remainder of the shift. I felt an immediate, irrational resistance to leaving the tower unattended, a sense that my presence, however passive, had been part of an equilibrium I did not understand. As we drove away, I watched the tower recede in the rearview mirror. For a brief moment, I thought I saw movement at the base, a flicker of vertical shapes where none should be. I blinked, looked again. There was nothing. The drive down was uneventful. Sunlight filtered through the trees. Dust rose behind the vehicle. Conversation returned to normal topics. By the time we reached the ranger station, the night already felt distant, unreal, compressed into a series of notes and impressions. They offered medical evaluation. I declined. They suggested sleep. I agreed. I was assigned a small bunk room at the station, window facing the forest edge. Exhaustion caught up with me quickly. I lay down fully clothed and closed my eyes, telling myself that rest was necessary, that daylight and company were safeguards. I slept. I dreamed of the tower. In the dream, it was taller than before, the ladder extending far beyond the cabin to the sky. I was climbing upward, not down, hands aching, lungs burning. Above me, just out of sight, something climbed at the same pace, always maintaining distance. I never saw it. I only knew it was there, because it adjusted when I slowed, stopped when I stopped. I woke abruptly at 12:30, Heart racing, the room too quiet. Outside the window, at the edge of the trees, something stood between the trunks. It did not move when I looked at it. It did not retreat when a ranger walked past moments later. And when I blinked, it was gone. I did not report what I saw outside the bunk room window. There was no hesitation or internal debate about it. The decision was immediate and instinctive, as if some part of me understood that speaking about it would shift something I could not put back. Instead, I sat up on the edge of the bed and waited, listening to the sounds of the ranger station, settling into its midday rhythm. Radios murmured from the main office. Boots crossed the hallway. Someone laughed in the distance. Everything sounded normal, anchored, indisputably real. I checked the time again, 12:32. The events at the tower had occurred less than 12 hours earlier. Yet already they felt misaligned with the present, like memories recalled out of sequence. I stood and walked to the window cautiously, half expecting the shape to return as soon as I looked away. The tree line was empty. Sunlight filtered through branches, casting uneven shadows across the dirt. Nothing stood where it had before. I told myself it was exhaustion. The station supervisor suggested I eat before attempting to sleep again. I joined the others in the break area, accepted a plate of reheated food, and sat at the end of the table. Conversation drifted around me, light and procedural. A fire had been spotted 2 districts over. Someone complained about the coffee. I nodded when appropriate, answered questions briefly, kept my voice steady. No one mentioned the tower. At 13:10, one of the rangers who had escorted me down received a radio call. He stepped aside, listened, then returned with a neutral expression. He said the replacement lookout had reached Tower 17 and reported no issues. Visibility good. Conditions stable. The word stable caught my attention. I asked it had mentioned anything unusual. The ranger shook his head. Quiet up there, he said. Nothing moving but wind. I focused on my food and finished eating, though I could not remember tasting any of it. The rest assignment required I remain at the station until at least the following morning. I was given permission to use the showers and laundry facilities, small concessions meant to help me reset. I stood under hot water longer than necessary, letting the noise drown out my thoughts, watching steam fill the stall. For several seconds at a time, I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the water to change temperature on its own, for pressure to drop, for some indication that systems were responding to something other than my actions. Nothing happened. By mid-afternoon, fatigue returned, heavier this time, pressing down behind my eyes. I lay back on the bunk again, telling myself I would rest but remain alert. That intention dissolved quickly. Sleep took me in uneven fragments. I dreamed again. This time I was standing in the forest below the tower, looking up. The ladder stretched down toward me, but it did not reach the ground. It stopped several feet short, swaying slightly. Above, the cab windows were dark. I called out, heard my voice echo strangely, too many times, overlapping. From behind me, footsteps approached, careful not to disturb leaves or twigs. I knew without turning that if I looked back, the ladder would begin to descend. I woke at 16:45, throat dry, heart pounding. The station was quieter now, the afternoon lull settling in. I sat up slowly, grounding myself in the room. Bunk. Window. Everything where it should be. I stood and stretched, feeling the stiffness in my legs, the residual tension in my shoulders. That was when I noticed the mark on my hand. It was faint, a pale impression across the heel of my palm, shaped like pressure rather than injury. No bruising. No broken skin. It looked as I had pressed my hand against something smooth and unyielding for a prolonged period. I turned my hand over, flexed my fingers. There was no pain. I tried to remember when I might have done that. Nothing came to mind. At 17:20, the replacement lookout radioed in again. Routine check. No issues. He commented on how clear the view was, how far he could see in every direction. The supervisor acknowledged and logged it. I listened from the doorway, a subtle unease building with each casual exchange. Clear view. At 1800, the station generator cycled unexpectedly. Lights flickered once, then steadied. Someone cursed softly from the equipment room. It was fixed within minutes, dismissed as a minor load imbalance. I stood very still during the outage, listening for sounds that did not return with the lights. Nothing followed. As evening approached, the sky took on the muted colors of late summer dusk. I found myself drawn back to the window, scanning the tree line without fully realizing I was doing it. The forest edge remained empty. Birds settled. Insects began their chorus. Normal transitions, familiar rhythms. I almost believed the night at the tower had been an isolated incident, a convergence of stress, isolation, and imagination. At 19:30, a ranger approached me quietly and asked if I was feeling all right. He said, I had been staring out the window for several minutes without moving. I thanked him for checking and assured him I was fine. He hesitated, then nodded and walked away. I did not look back at the window until he was gone. The shape was there again. This time, it stood farther back, partially obscured by trees, its outline broken by branches. It did not resolve into a clear form, but I could tell it was upright, oriented toward the building. It did not sway with the wind. It did not shift when shadows moved around it. I stepped closer to the glass, heart hammering. As I did, the shape stepped backward, deeper into the forest, maintaining distance with deliberate precision. It stopped when I stopped. It did not retreat completely. It simply adjusted. A realization settled over me then, heavy and unwelcome. Whatever had surrounded the tower had not been confined to that place. It had not lost interest when I left. It had followed the variable that mattered. Me. At 2010, the replacement lookout reported something odd over the radio. He described a brief interference pattern on his instruments, a momentary flicker in the fire finder alignment. He recalibrated and found no fault. He laughed it off, said it was probably nothing. The supervisor responded professionally, made a note, moved on. I closed the bunk room door and locked it, though there was no requirement to do so. The lock engaged with a soft click that sounded final in a way I did not like. Night settled outside the station, and somewhere beyond the windows, just past the reach of artificial light, I knew with quiet certainty that the forest was arranging itself again, spacing its shadows carefully, waiting for the conditions it preferred. I did not leave the bunk room again that night. The station followed its usual routine around me. Radios changed shifts. Doors opened and closed. The generator hummed steadily. I could hear voices in the hallway, familiar names, familiar patterns. All of it existed at a careful distance, close enough to confirm I was not alone. Far enough that none of it interfered with my thoughts. I sat on the edge of the bunk with my boots still on, back straight, hands folded, listening. At 2100, the replacement lookout checked in once more. His voice was calm, conversational. He mentioned how quiet it had become up there, how the forest seemed to settle earlier than usual. He joked that it felt like the tower was holding its breath. A few people chuckled over the radio. I did not. The phrase stayed with me, repeating in my head long after the channel cleared. At 21:30, I turned off the bunk room light and sat in the dark. The window framed a rectangle of night, the forest beyond lit faintly by spillover from the station's exterior lamps. The shadows held steady at first. Trees stood where they should. Depth made sense. Then, gradually, it didn't. The edge of the light seemed to shorten, retreating by inches, not abruptly, but slowly enough that it was easy to doubt my perception. I watched the illuminated ground recede until the forest line appeared closer than it had earlier, as if the darkness were encroaching rather than falling. I stood and pressed my palm flat against the glass. The mark on my hand tingled, a faint pressure without pain, like a memory stored in the skin. I pulled my hand back quickly and wiped it against my pants, unsettled by the sensation. At 22:05, there was a knock on the door. It was soft, controlled, not the casual rap of someone passing by, but something intentional, measured. I did not answer immediately. I listened for footsteps retreating, for a voice calling my name. Nothing followed. The knock came again, same rhythm, same pressure. I asked who it was. There was a pause long enough that I considered the possibility that I had imagined it. Then a voice answered, clear and close, from just outside the door. It was my voice, not distorted, not exaggerated. It spoke with my cadence, my inflection, even the slight hesitation I have before certain words. It said my name the way I say it when introducing myself professionally. I did not move. The voice continued, calmly explained that there had been a misunderstanding, that everything was fine, that the supervisor wanted to see me in the office. It sounded reasonable, helpful, concerned. I stayed silent. The voice stopped. For several seconds, there was nothing. Then the handle turned. It did not open. The lock held. The handle released, slowly, without force. I listened for footsteps leaving the doorway. There were none. At 22:20, the radio on the desk crackled to life on its own. No call sign. No channel identification. Just static resolving into a familiar tone. My tone. It described the bunk room accurately. The layout. The position of the bed. The way the window faced the tree line. It commented on my posture, the way my shoulders were tense, the way my breathing was shallow. I unplugged the radio. The voice continued anyway, carried now through the walls, through the air itself, no longer tied to any device. It spoke about the tower again, about how elevation had limited interaction, how proximity improved communication. It suggested that the station was a better environment for observation, more variables, more access. I backed away from the desk until my calves touched the bunk. At 2300, the station lights flickered. This time, they did not come back on immediately. Emergency lighting engaged, casting long, distorted shadows down the hallway. I heard someone swear softly. Heard boots moving quickly, doors opening. The normal sounds of response. I waited for someone to knock on my door, to ask if I was all right. No one came. In the dim red glow, I saw movement outside the window. Not a single shape this time, but several standing at different depths, partially overlapping. They did not press close to the glass. They did not need to. They were positioned exactly where the light ended, where detail dissolved into suggestion. They were closer than before. The voice spoke again, softer now, no longer using my voice. It told me the tower had been a test of distance. The station, it said, was a test of integration. It explained that I had responded appropriately so far, that my attention, my restraint, my documentation had been noted. It said that not everyone noticed the spacing. Not everyone respected the limits of visibility. I asked what it wanted. The answer came without hesitation. It said it wanted continuity. The lights returned abruptly, flooding the room with harsh white illumination. The shapes outside were gone. The forest looked ordinary again, depth restored, distance re-established. In the hallway, voices resumed, confused but unconcerned. Someone laughed nervously about the generator. I remained where I was unmoving until midnight passed. At 2015, the replacement lookout checked in again. His voice sounded strained. He reported hearing movement on the ladder beneath the cab. He said he could see it clearly this time, the ladder vibrating, rungs flexing under weight. He said he had looked down and seen nothing. The supervisor advised him to remain calm, suggested temperature shift, structural noise. The same explanations given to me. I closed my eyes briefly, just long enough to steady myself. When I opened them, I understood something with absolute clarity. The tower had not been the origin point. It had been a demonstration. And now that the demonstration was complete, the observers no longer needed it. They had learned where to stand. They had learned how to speak. And most importantly, they had learned how far away they needed to be to remain unseen. I did not sleep at all after that. The station quieted in stages, voices thinning. Footsteps spacing out as the night shift settled in. I remained seated on the bunk, back against the wall, eyes fixed on the window. I did not expect the shapes to return immediately. What unsettled me most was the certainty that they did not need to rush. At 01:10, the replacement lookout radioed again. This time, he did not try to sound calm. He reported that the ladder noise had stopped, but that something else had begun instead. He said the windows of the cab were fogging from the outside, uneven patches appearing and fading, as if someone were breathing against the glass. He paused before adding that the fog did not match the temperature or humidity readings. He could not explain it. The supervisor asked him to confirm whether he could see anyone. The reply came after a delay. "No," he said, "but I can tell where they're standing." The channel went quiet. I stood and moved closer to the bunk room door, pressing my ear against it, listening to the sounds of the station. Everything seemed normal. Too normal. Radios murmured. Someone coughed. A chair scraped faintly across the floor. No one appeared to be reacting to anything unusual. At 01:45, there was a knock on my door again. This one was different. Firmer. More confident. I did not ask who it was. I already knew the answer would not help. The voice spoke without waiting. It used the supervisor's voice this time, perfectly replicated, right down to the tired patience he carried late in a shift. It said there was an update from the tower, that they needed my input, that my experience was relevant. It framed the request as procedural. Routine, something that would be irresponsible to ignore. I stayed silent. The voice sighed softly, as if disappointed but not surprised. Then it spoke in its own tone again, neutral and uninflected. It told me that resistance was not noncompliance. That observation could occur without cooperation. That proximity accelerated understanding. The handle turned once more. The lock held. I backed away until I was standing in the center of the room, hands clenched at my sides. At 02:30, the replacement lookout stopped responding. Repeated hails went unanswered. Dispatch attempted alternate channels. Another tower was asked to relay. No response. The supervisor's voice tightened, concern replacing irritation. A ranger unit was notified, though no one said the word emergency out loud. I felt a hollow certainty settle in my stomach. From the window, I saw the forest shift again. This time, the movement was not subtle. The spacing changed visibly, trunks seeming to slide relative to one another as shadows realigned. It was not that the trees were moving, exactly. It was that the spaces between them were being redefined. Depth collapsed and expanded in slow pulses, like breathing. The shapes appeared one by one, not stepping into view, but resolving out of the darkness, as if they had always been there. They stood closer than before, just beyond the reach of the station lights. I counted at least 6, possibly more. They did not face the building uniformly. Some were angled toward the tower's direction, others toward the station, as if tracking multiple points of interest at once. The voice spoke again, no longer addressing me alone. It announced that the observation phase was nearing completion. I dropped to a seated position on the bunk, suddenly aware of how small the room was, how thin the walls felt. The voice explained that environments with elevation and isolation produced cleaner data, but environments with population density produced more variables, more opportunities for pattern recognition. It said the replacement lookout had adapted more quickly than expected. At 03:15, the radio on the desk turned on by itself again. This time, the voice that came through was not mine. It was the replacement lookout's. He was breathing hard, speaking in fragments, describing figures standing just beyond the cab windows, faces pressed close enough to distort against the glass. He said they were not trying to get in. He said they were watching him write, watching him log. Then his voice changed, not abruptly. Gradually. His words slowed, cadence smoothing out, emotion draining away. He began repeating phrases I recognized from my own log entries. Sentences I had written hours earlier at the tower. He recited them with perfect accuracy. The transmission ended mid-sentence. No static. No sign-off, just silence. The supervisor ordered the channel cleared. He instructed everyone to maintain station security and await the ranger unit. His voice shook despite his effort to control it. I could hear people moving more quickly now, tension finally breaking through routine. Outside, the shapes adjusted again. They were closer still. I realized then that the station itself was becoming another tower. Not in structure, but in function. A focal point. A place to measure responses. To compare behaviors, to see how awareness spread. The voice addressed me directly one last time before dawn. It said that continuity did not require permanence, only recurrence, only someone who noticed. It thanked me. At 04:50, the first hint of morning light touched the sky. The forest began to separate into recognizable forms again. The shapes faded, not retreating, but losing definition, dissolving back into the spaces between trees. By the time the ranger unit arrived at the station, just after sunrise, everything looked ordinary. The replacement lookout was found alive at the base of the tower, standing barefoot in the dirt, staring up at the cab. He did not resist when they approached. He did not respond to his name. When they guided him away, he continued to look upward, lips moving silently. They asked me questions for hours. I answered carefully. I did not tell them everything. Some observations are not meant to be shared. Some spacing, once noticed, cannot be ignored. They kept me at the station through the morning. It was not presented as confinement. No one used language like hold or detain. It was framed as availability, as cooperation, as concern for my well-being. I was asked to remain nearby in case additional questions arose, in case the investigation required clarification, in case my statement needed to be amended for accuracy. I agreed to everything. The replacement lookout was transported out shortly after sunrise. I watched from the station steps as they guided him into the vehicle. He walked without resistance, posture rigid. Gaze fixed straight ahead now instead of upward. His lips no longer moved. When the door closed, I felt something ease in the air. A tension releasing, like a held breath finally let go. It did not feel like an ending. The supervisors conducted their review with careful thoroughness. Logs were cross-checked. Instrument data was downloaded and analyzed. Structural engineers were contacted about the ladder vibrations. Psychological evaluations were suggested, then quietly postponed. There were no accusations. There was no dismissal of my account, either. That unsettled me more than skepticism would have. By mid-morning, I noticed a pattern in the questions. They did not focus on what I had seen. They focused on when I had noticed it. What time I first became aware of spacing. How long I had observed before responding. Whether I had acted immediately or waited. Whether I had attempted to change my environment or simply documented it. They were not asking about the observers. They were asking about the observation. At 10:40, I was informed that Tower 17 would be temporarily decommissioned pending inspection. Access would be restricted. The area around the base would be cordoned off. The decision was delivered neutrally, as if it were routine. I nodded, signed where required, and handed over my keys. Something in the forest shifted when that decision was spoken aloud. Not visibly. Not audibly. It was a change I felt in the same way. One senses a drop in pressure before a storm. The tower had been removed from the equation. One variable eliminated. Another remained. I was cleared to leave the station shortly after noon. They offered transportation. I declined and signed out a service vehicle instead. I wanted control over my movement, however symbolic it might be. As I drove away, I did not look toward the tree line. I focused on the road, on the dust curling behind the tires, on the measured turn of the wheel. The forest receded. For several miles, nothing unusual occurred. The road wound through familiar terrain, sunlit and quiet. I began to relax despite myself, the tension in my shoulders easing as distance grew between me and the station. Then I noticed how consistently empty the pullouts were. No parked vehicles, no hikers, no service trucks. It was not unusual individually, but taken together it felt curated. As if human presence had been selectively thinned along my route. At a bend in the road where the trees opened briefly to reveal a slope below, I glanced sideways. The spacing was wrong. The trees stood at regular intervals that did not match natural growth patterns. The ground between them appeared flattened, smooth, as if compressed by repeated passage. I slowed instinctively, heart pounding, then forced myself to continue driving. At 13:25, the radio crackled. I had not turned it on. Static resolved into a carrier tone, then a voice that was not any I recognized. It did not identify itself. It did not request response. It spoke as if continuing a conversation already in progress. It stated that removal of the tower reduced environmental distortion. That mobile observation presented new challenges, but increased data richness. That transitional states were particularly valuable. I did not respond. The voice continued anyway, commenting on my speed. On the way my grip tightened on the steering wheel, when curves sharpened. It described the view ahead before I reached it, naming landmarks just seconds before they came into sight. I turned the radio off. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. Too complete. Even the sound of the engine felt muted, as if absorbed by the surrounding forest. At 14:10, I reached a long straightaway, bordered by dense trees on both sides. Visibility narrowed. Shadows stretched across the road in parallel bands. I had the sudden, overwhelming sense that if I stopped the vehicle, something would step into the road. I did not stop. The feeling persisted until the trees finally thinned and the road opened toward the lowlands. When it did, the pressure eased, receding just enough to let me breathe again. By late afternoon, I reached the edge of the service district. Civilization reasserted itself in small ways. A gas station, a cluster of parked cars, a billboard weathered by sun. I pulled over and shut off the engine, sitting in the quiet, hands still trembling. Nothing followed me into the open. That night, I stayed in a motel near the highway. Artificial light filled the room. Traffic noise bled through the walls. I slept in short intervals, waking often, but nothing came to the door. No voices spoke through electronics. The forest remained at a comfortable distance. For the first time since the tower, I believed that perhaps the conditions had been specific. That isolation and elevation had mattered more than I had understood. That by leaving that environment behind, I had removed myself from relevance. The thought was comforting. It lasted until morning. When I opened the curtains, I saw the motel parking lot exactly as I expected. Cars lined up in uneven rows. Asphalt cracked and patched. Ordinary human disorder. At the far edge of the lot, beyond the last parked vehicle, the trees began, and I could tell immediately and without doubt that they had been arranged to account for where I would stand when I looked at them. Not where I was standing now, but where I would stand next. I did not stay to finish packing. The realization at the edge of the parking lot carried a weight that made delay feel dangerous. It was not fear in the immediate sense. There was no surge of adrenaline, no urge to run. It was a quieter certainty. The understanding that time spent stationary was time spent becoming predictable. I closed the curtains without taking my eyes off the tree line and gathered my things by touch rather than sight. The room felt smaller than it had moments before, as if its dimensions were being reconsidered. When I opened the door, the hallway was empty, carpet muffling my footsteps. I left the key on the desk and walked out without looking back. Morning traffic had begun to build along the highway. Engines passed, voices carried, the ordinary chaos of movement providing a kind of camouflage. I merged into it deliberately, keeping my speed consistent, choosing routes that offered options rather than destinations. I did not turn on the radio. I did not check my phone. For several hours, nothing happened. The forest receded in stages, replaced by scrub, then open fields, then low industrial structures. The pressure I had come to associate with attention thinned until it felt almost imaginary. I began to think that the arrangement I had noticed was simply the last echo of exhaustion, my mind still imposing patterns where none existed. That illusion held until early afternoon. I stopped at a rest area just outside a small town, choosing it because it was busy. Families moved between vehicles. A bus idled near the far curb. Children ran ahead of parents without concern. I sat on a bench in full view of everyone and drank water slowly, forcing myself to remain present. When I looked toward the trees at the edge of the lot, they appeared normal. I stood. The spacing changed, Not abruptly. Not dramatically. Just enough. A trunk that had been hidden by another became visible. A gap narrowed. A shadow aligned itself with where my eyes settled. The adjustment stopped when I stopped moving. I sat back down. The forest relaxed. That was when I understood the final parameter. They were no longer arranging the environment around a fixed structure. They were arranging it around me. The insight brought with it a clarity that bordered on relief. This was not pursuit. There was no urgency. What they were doing required patience, calibration, subtlety. They did not need to corner me. They needed to remain just outside my certainty, where doubt would do the rest of the work. I left the rest area without incident. Over the next 2 days, I tested the boundaries quietly. I chose crowded places and empty ones, high ground and low, motion and stillness. In every case, the effect was the same. The environment responded only when I oriented myself toward it, when observation occurred. The moment I disengaged, the spacing loosened, the pressure eased. They did not follow me into rooms without windows. They did not speak when I was surrounded by movement. They did not interfere. They waited. On the 3rd night, I returned home. My apartment is on the 2nd floor of an aging building, surrounded by other structures, streets, human noise. From my windows, I can see rooftops, power lines, a narrow strip of sky. There are trees several blocks away, reduced to background texture rather than presence. For a while, that was enough. I resumed routine carefully. I avoided reflective surfaces. I positioned furniture away from windows. I slept in short intervals, waking often, but without incident. Weeks passed. The world settled into something like normal. Then I was asked to submit a final report. It was a formality, they said. Closure. An opportunity to clarify details now that time had passed. I was assured it would not be shared beyond the department. I believed them. I sat at my desk late one evening, lights on, curtains drawn, and began to write. I chose my words carefully. I documented only what I could support. Times, sounds, movements. I avoided interpretation. I avoided conclusions. I believed that restraint still mattered. As I wrote, I became aware of a familiar sensation. Not pressure. Alignment. The room felt subtly oriented, as if angles had shifted to favor a particular perspective. I paused, hands hovering over the keyboard, and listened. Nothing. The city outside continued as usual. I returned to the report. When I finished, I leaned back and closed my eyes. Behind my eyelids, the spacing resolved perfectly. Not of trees of thoughts. I understood then what continuity meant. They were not interested in towers or stations or forests as places. Those were instruments. What they required was a stable point of reference. Someone capable of noticing without reacting, of observing without disrupting the pattern. Someone who would continue. I submitted the report the next morning. Nothing happened. Life went on. I am no longer employed as a fire lookout. I avoid isolated environments when I can, but isolation is not a prerequisite anymore. I have learned that distance is contextual. That visibility depends on where attention rests. I have learned how to move through the world without disturbing its arrangement too much. And on nights when sleep will not come, I sit in the dark and practice not looking past the limits of my vision. Because I know, with absolute certainty, that wherever that line falls, something is standing just beyond it, waiting.